When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's look at every Berserk fan's go-to weapon, the Greatsword. The Greatsword is a large two-handed sword that traces its lineage to the longswords of the Middle Ages, but was not truly developed until the Renaissance era. While we have a couple more videos until we get to the longsword, when it comes to weapon categorization, the difference between longswords and greatswords actually gets a bit messy, mostly because our common understanding of the longsword is wrong. The longsword exists mostly as a broader category of weapons between the one-handed arming sword and the two-handed greatsword, including weapons such as the bastard sword, which could be wielded in one or two hands. Modern historians identify the longsword with a double-edged blade measuring 80 to 110 centimeters, a grip measuring 15 to 30 centimeters, and a weight of 1 to 2 kilograms. The greatsword, on the other hand, is considered to have a double-edged blade measuring 100 to 120 centimeters, a handle measuring 20 to 40 centimeters, and a weight of 2 to 4 kilograms. Based on these definitions alone, a two-handed sword with a 100 centimeter blade that weighs 2 kilograms could be both a longsword and a greatsword, and both would technically be right. There's gotta be an easier way to tell these weapons apart though, right? Well, I'm glad I asked myself that question, because it lets me segue into my next point. Introduced in 1960 by historian and illustrator Ewart Oakeshott, the Oakeshott typology organizes swords into different categories based on several factors, such as its cross-section, length, fuller characteristics, and taper. The longsword of the 14th and 15th centuries generally falls into category 16A, with later longswords being represented by types 18B and 18C. These blades were long and slowly tapered, with a fuller running up 1/3 of the blade length, and were a compromise between thrusting and slashing capabilities. Greatswords, on the other hand, were separated out into types 12A and 13A. Larger variants of the type 12 and 13, these were primarily intended for cutting, with a lenticular cross-section, a broad flat taper, and a fuller running along 2/3 or half of the blade. While those types were mostly used in the 13th and 14th centuries, the 15th centuries saw the greatsword transition to the type 15A. These were more slender blades, with a strong taper and a flattened diamond cross-section. Their added length and weight often meant that greatswords required the use of both hands to be wielded effectively. The truest example of the greatsword in European history has to be the Zweihander, a favorite among German and Swiss mercenaries. Used from the 1500s to the 1600s, the two-hander became common as an infantry weapon to counter pike formations in the Renaissance era. The legendary Frisian farmer, peasant leader, and pirate Groot Pierre, literally meaning Big Pierre, was said to wield a 2-meter-long Zweihander with ease, most notably during the Frisian Rebellion, where it's said that he managed to behead several people with a single blow. The greatsword was not a uniquely European invention, though. In the Kamakura period of Japan, from 1185 to 1333, longer katana, known as odachi, became popular. Forged with a curved blade measuring 90 to 370 centimeters, odachi weighed anywhere from 2.2 to 14.5 kilograms. The odachi was so big that samurai could not draw it from the hip. causing many to carry it on their backs, carry it in their hands, or better yet, have their servants carry it for them. The odachi's popularity peaked in the 14th century, but regular infantry gradually switched back to the yari spear and naginata polearm due to their ease of use, and by the dawn of the Edo period in 1603, the odachi was regarded less as a weapon and more as a symbolic offering to the kami of Shinto shrines. Over in China, the Changdao appeared as early as the Tang dynasty in the 600s AD. With a single-edged curved blade just under 1 meter long and a 1.2 meter handle, the Changdao blurs the line between a greatsword and a glaive. After the Tang dynasty, the Dao had completely overtaken the Jian straight sword as the primary close combat weapon, with later variants like the Zhanma Dao, Wo Dao, and Miao Dao remaining relevant into the mid-20th century. While greatswords fell out of use on the battlefield thanks to firearms, they've remained popular in the modern era thanks to historical martial arts as well as pop culture depictions. There's just something special about really big swords that captures the imagination. Maybe it's their association with knights and samurai warriors. Maybe it's because Kentaro Miura decided to give Guts a giant sword in the 1989 Berserk manga. Or maybe it's just human nature to look at a giant sword and think, wow, that's awesome. Whatever the reason, the greatsword remains a staple in media and gaming to this very day, being featured in Berserk, the Dark Souls series, and tabletop games like D&D. In D&D, the greatsword is defined as a type of two-handed martial sword. As the largest member of the sword family, the greatsword required two hands and a lot of training to wield properly. Present as its own weapon since 3rd edition, the greatsword of older editions would cost between 30 and 50 gold pieces, weighed 3.6 kilograms, and dealt either 1d10 or 2d6 slashing damage. In 5th edition, the greatsword costs 50 gold pieces, weighs 2.7 kilograms, deals 2d6 slashing damage, and has the heavy and two-handed weapon properties. Much like the great axe we discussed in last week's video, the greatsword is a simple, hard-hitting heavy weapon. It costs 20 gold pieces more than the great axe, requires two hands to wield, and imposes disadvantage on small races who try to use it. But it weighs 0.4 kilograms less and deals, on average, slightly more damage over time. All of this leads me back to one word to describe the greatsword: consistent. While not the optimal damage option for min-maxers, if your character can afford it, the greatsword is consistent with putting out good, average damage at the cost of the defense an offhand shield would provide. While its differences from the great axe are minuscule, it's still distinct enough to be a viable alternative for characters that are looking for multiple heavy weapon options. So, the greatsword is a very consistent heavy weapon, giving any character that wields it a good way to cleave through enemies. Unfortunately, the stripped-down combat mechanics of 5th edition don't showcase that very well, and make the difference between a great axe and a greatsword only matter to statistics majors who calculate average damage potential. If we left the greatsword as it is now, it would likely remain a fun and viable heavy weapon option. Even with how good it is now, though, I still want to take a look at whether adding more unique features can make it better, while keeping it in line with the other weapons of 5th edition. So, while we're not necessarily fixing the greatsword, let's take a look at some ideas on how we can keep it viable and help it stand out more. My first suggestion is to bring back the greatsword's expanded critical range from 3rd edition. In 3rd edition D&D, The Greatsword was a two-handed martial weapon that dealt 2d6 slashing damage. However, as with the short sword and long sword, it had an expanded critical range, allowing it to critically strike on natural 19s or natural 20s. This was offset by the axe weapons, which required a natural 20 to crit, but when they did crit, they tripled the damage instead of doubling it. Reintroducing these differences not only make the weapons more distinct from one another, but further emphasize the Greatsword's role as a consistent heavy weapon option. Sure, it won't be able to deal up to 3d12 damage on a crit, but players who use it will be able to critically strike more often, which across an entire campaign may be better for some builds or classes, such as champion fighters. My second suggestion on how to keep the Greatsword viable and fun would be to allow it to swap between slashing and piercing damage types. While the historical Greatsword may have been designed to emphasize slashing over piercing, it certainly was possible for trained users to stab at their opponents with the tip of their blade. Inspired by Pathfinder's versatile trait, which allows the Pathfinder Greatsword to swap between slashing and piercing, this feature would allow users to change their damage type to adapt to their enemies' vulnerabilities, resistances, or immunities, even in the midst of combat. The downside to this suggestion is that many 5th edition monsters don't come with resistances, vulnerabilities, and immunities. So, dungeon masters would have to tweak existing monsters to make choosing between damage types actually meaningful in the game. My third and final suggestion on how to keep the Greatsword fun and interesting in D&D is to add a weapon property that allows users to deal a little bit of damage even if they miss their weapon attack. In the 1D&D Unearthed Arcana, one of the proposed ways that Wizards is going to fix martial classes is by adding weapon masteries, which essentially give certain classes an extra ability they can use with a weapon. For Greatswords, their weapon property is Graze, which states that if your attack roll with the weapon misses a creature, you can deal damage to that creature equal to the ability modifier used to make the attack roll. So, in practice, if a character misses an attack with the Greatsword, but they have a +3 strength modifier, they still deal 3 damage to the creature even though they missed. This means that even on a miss, you still do consistent damage with the Greatsword, even if that damage is limited to your ability score modifier. Plus, this damage can only be increased through ability score increases, and given the wording of feats like Slasher and Great Weapon Master, it couldn't really be stacked with overpowered feats to break combat encounters. It's certainly not adding a lot of damage, but this once again makes the Greatsword the consistently good weapon choice. All in all, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to keep the Greatsword viable while adding some fun extra features. The Greatsword doesn't really need these changes, and even if the Greatsword was a little worse than it is now, people would probably still use it, just because using a giant sword is awesome. However, if we're going to be adding new features to all the other weapons of D&D, we can't skip the Greatsword, because every weapon option in D&D should feel rewarding, impactful, and fun to use. But with that, we come to the end of today's video on the Greatsword. Realistically, it's more of just a good sword rather than a great sword. But if we add in some options that emphasize its role as a consistent damage dealer, Greatsword users can feel a lot more secure with the weapons they wield. Even if we leave it as is, there's still something really cool about facing down a horde of monsters with nothing but a giant hunk of iron in your hands. However, what I'd like to know is, what do you think of the Greatsword? Do you think it should stay as it is now? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward? Or did you have your own ideas on how to give the Greatsword some more flavor in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Alt-Roll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Alt-Roll, you can visit our Ko-fi link in the description to leave a one-time or recurring donation. And make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. However, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.